Have you ever shot a video and wondered why the motion looked a bit off? Maybe it was too blurry, maybe it was overly sharp. As a media production educator, this is a problem that my students have faced countless times. And it all boils down to one camera setting, shutter speed. And make sure you stick around until the end of the video, where I'll teach you a really neat trick that I've taught my students to ensure that you get this setting right every time. So shutter speed is all about how long your camera's sensor is exposed to light for each frame. This directly affects how motion appears in your shots. So let's break this down. The faster your shutter speed, like 1/1000th of a second, the less motion blur you get. The slower your shutter speed, like 1/10th of a second, the more motion blur you get. But here's the thing. If you set your shutter speed incorrectly, the motion in your footage is not going to look correct and your video won't replicate what we see with our eyes as human beings. I remember the first time I experimented with shutter speed when I was a student. I tried a very slow shutter speed to get the right exposure, and as soon as there was movement in my shot, the motion blur was exaggerated, which made the footage look smeared and jittery. On the other hand, when you set your shutter speed too fast, as soon as there's movement in your shot, the motion is going to be too smooth and too sharp, resulting in potentially choppy footage that makes the movement look somewhat unnatural and harsh. While extra motion blur or really sharp movement could be used for artistic purposes in a project, perhaps think of a dream sequence as an example in a short fiction film, it's not really advisable to use this when you're trying to replicate reality with your project. There's actually a really neat trick to setting your shutter speed, a trick that I've taught all of my students, and that is to stick to the rule of doubling your frame rate, which is also called the 180-degree shutter rule. This rule creates motion blur that feels natural to the human eye and essentially replicates reality. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, for instance, your shutter speed should be set to 1/48, and if your camera cannot achieve that setting, 1/50 is close enough. This shutter speed will replicate the motion blur that we naturally see with our eyes as human beings. Now that you've got a solid understanding on how shutter speed works, I'd highly encourage you to check out this next video where I explain the next essential setting, ISO. It's all about controlling your camera's sensitivity to light, and it can make or break your footage. I'll see you there.